Hello, and welcome to all of you who've joined us for this evening's conversation with Beatrix Campbell about her new book, Secrets and Silence. I hope it will be both enlightening and enraging, which I think is the dual spur that we need for any action. I want to thank A Woman's Place for hosting this event. We hope to talk for no longer than 40 to 45 minutes, and then there will be time at the end for you to ask questions. But of course, if you have thought of any questions as you go along, then please do make a note of them in the chat. My name is Rahila Gupta, and I am currently chair of Southall Black Sisters. I'm a writer and a journalist, and I've been knocking around for a little while as an anti-racist feminist. Probably fair to say a little bit more than a little while. Beatrix Campbell, please do introduce yourself.
Well, I'm a bit like you, Rahila, although I'm even older than you. So I've been knocking around far too long. And as a communist, a feminist, emancipated by the women's liberation movement, and I'm a journalist, and I write and fret, I should think, about everything.
Good, thank you, Bea. So I'm delighted to be here talking to my buddy Bea about her extremely important new book on an extremely important subject, the institutional failure to deal with child sexual abuse. And I have to admit that my delight is twofold. One, of course, that this important piece of research has seen the light of day, finally. But I have to admit to a certain personal vested interest here too, because now it means that Bea is free to devote her time to our joint project on patriarchy. So on that note, let's begin. Can you talk a little bit about your journey from the first book on the Cleveland inquiry to the new book? I know that at the beginning, when you started this project, you said that you were probably going to write a couple of chapters. You're going to update it by a couple of chapters. But in the end, it turned out to be a whole new approach and a whole new book. And I just wanted to find out what were the changes, the developments in policy and practice, and possibly in your own thinking around these issues that led to this whole new book?
I think there were two things that made me think, right, this story isn't what I thought it was. When I did the first book, I assumed that the project of the Cleveland inquiry into a little local combustion, as we now could understand, in the northern county of Cleveland, a combustion between professionals interested in child protection and child sexual abuse, a community that was interested in and felt very strongly about sexual crimes against women and children, and a police service that was notoriously heavy duty, macho, didn't really like having to deal with stuff like rape, sexual abuse, child abuse, and certainly didn't like having to cooperate with other professions, notably ones where there were some strong women with strong voices and lots of experience of these things. So the context of Cleveland was this huge conflict. The police went to their friends in Parliament and the government, and an inquiry was called. And I felt at the time that the inquiry was a way of not thinking about what had happened. It was a way of managing a conflict, or rather managing a phenomenon by not managing it at all. I had to change my mind when 2-3 decades later, there was a kind of a renewal of discovery and concern about child sexual abuse following the deaths of Cyril Smith and Jimmy Savile, which unleashed a torrent of allegations about childhood abuse that had been not dealt with, not noticed, not addressed. And in the wake of that, in turn, the huge revelation of organised sexual exploitation in towns all across the country. So it felt like a time to revisit the dispute which had framed the way in which child sexual abuse was thought about and addressed in Britain. So first off, you know, you talk to whoever you can lay your hands on who's still alive, and some of the professionals who were involved in the controversy. And there was one thing I have to tell you that took me to the National Archives. We had the privilege of receiving in the proverbial brown envelope, an anonymous package, a document by the Northern Regional Health Authority, written immediately after the Cleveland inquiry had been published in 1988, that said that the majority of the children, around 75%, had been abused, that the majority of the diagnoses were believed to be correct, and that this was a higher than average rate of diagnostic accuracy. Now that completely contravened what had become the prevailing conventional wisdom, which was that these doctors were mad, the social workers were horrible, the police were goodies, innocent families had been ruined, etc. And thereafter, child protection professionals everywhere were chided, cautioned. The word Cleveland was invoked endlessly as a warning to not do things. Okay, so the first thing to do was to find out whether this secret document, never published, was in the National Archives. And eventually I found it, completely redacted with those very dramatic figures censored. To this day, amazing. However, in around 2018, a very thin little file was released to the National Archives. And I remember vividly thinking, what's this doing here? It was the Chancellor of the Exchequer's file in the Cleveland Archive. And that contained a short letter, which was dynamite. In fact, I keep a little page thingy in the book to remind me of the horror in this short letter. What it said was that the Treasury had been informed by the Department of Health that the doctor's diagnoses of anal rape, which was the core issue that so disturbed the police in this case, but their diagnoses were at least 80% correct. It also commented that this was, quote, dangerous territory. Why? Because it could attract bids for extra resources, so best not to mention it. And it never was mentioned. It was kept from Parliament. It was kept from us, the public. It was kept from the enduring public debates thereafter, only released under the 30-year rule. So the point about this is that once all this time on, we delve into the National Archives and we come up with a slip of paper that changes everything.
And how many lives have been destroyed in this process? Not just the professionals, but the children.
You're absolutely right. A generation of professionals were disempowered. The collective knowledge which they'd accumulated during the 1980s, which was a great decade of discovery. I call it an era of enlightenment. about what children endure and what some adults, particularly men, like doing to some children. All of that was erased. And the political and professional practice thereafter was based on skepticism, paranoia, restraint, and controlling the conditions in which children might speak. The other thing that I have to say, revisiting this prompted me to do, was to have another look at the report itself, obviously, and to go through transcripts of the original hearings in the Cleveland inquiry. And that was a bit devastating, because it made me realise that there were things that I'd either not noticed or forgotten, or just didn't, I don't know, didn't tick a box, didn't tick anybody's box. And these were also devastating. For example, the crucial chapter that became a kind of biblical or Talmudic chapter for all professionals. They would be harried in court proceedings if they hadn't read it properly. Chapter 12 says that children may, on the rare occasion, that's right, on the rare occasion that a child might choose not to tell. And you think, well, hold on a second, am I reading that right? Because of course at the time we knew that it was rare for a child to tell. Absolutely contrary to what the Cleveland report was promoting as a kind of common sense. It added that if professionals suspected, misdiagnosis, or they just suspected, then they could choose not to act. So they were given license to not intervene. The consequences of all of that were devastating for, as I say, a generation of professionals and a generation of children thereafter, and for democracy itself, because we were delivered an untruth in what was the defining document in child protection practice and politics in our time: an assault on children, an assault on professionals, and an assault on democracy.
This new enlightenment that you talk about, post-Cleveland, you sort of express a fear in the book that this new enlightenment in relation to child protection might be endangered again, just as it was after Cleveland. So I want to know what makes you say that. Are we not operating in a different reality, different context? Isn't there more kind of credibility where these claims are concerned?
Well, there is and there isn't. I think two things are happening in parallel. There is a kind of collective knowledge, and there always has been, certainly amongst women, that child sexual abuse is not unusual. It happens. We've known this for probably forever. But in the era of what we could call modern public service and the modern welfare state and the modern professions, there's a pattern. It's absolutely clear that knowledge about what children endure and what women endure depends upon a kind of coalition between professionals and survivors and political movements that are interested in the well-being of women and children. Feminism, absolutely crucial. When feminism fades, that collective knowledge fades. When feminism enjoys a kind of renaissance, its energy is revived, then a concern about child welfare again is revived. And there's a distinct pattern. The other element in that distinct pattern, however, is this: that each era of discovery, and they're usually very dramatic, is followed by an era of denial, disrespect, disdain.
Backlash, basically.
It's a backlash. And so I think we can say that the Cleveland report was part of a backlash, and the new knowledge that we've acquired about the phenomenon of child sexual abuse over the last 5 to 7 years has also been followed by a backlash. It's also been followed, I have to say, by the usual kind of rhetorical, no stone will be unturned. We will, you know, and of course, that doesn't happen because no resources are being attached to the investigation of child sexual abuse and the prevention of it.
You make quite an important distinction about the difference in the way in which child sexual abuse within the family and outside the family is now being investigated. It seems as if they are newly energized by, you know, in their investigations in terms of celebrities, outsiders, strangers, institutions, and so on and so forth. But within the family, it still remains a really difficult area. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting the way that when the scale of organised sexual exploitation of girls in cities all over Britain was exposed, and particularly Pakistani men were identified as culprits, people in the media who had hitherto been child sexual abuse skeptics fell upon it like dementors. Ah, fabulous. This was an Asian problem, not a man problem. Of course, it wasn't true. This was a man problem, as it always was. And one of the things that I think then becomes important is that kind of allowed an illusion of state, police, and political commitment to these unfortunate children. It didn't happen, but what it, you know, you're right, it shrouded the larger phenomenon of child sexual abuse within the family. Now, bear in mind, in 2020, Ofsted produced a devastating report that described the woeful response to child sexual abuse that happens in families. There wasn't a strategy, there wasn't prevention, there weren't resources to support the children. Woeful. It described children being abused in their families as unseen and unheard. That's the gift of the Cleveland report, in my opinion.
And I think there's another interesting thing you say about the Cleveland inquiry, that it was prompted by a need to blame rather than the need to know. So although you've touched on it a little bit, I mean, how does that skew what's happening, what happened then and what's happening today?
That could have, right, what happened in the 1980s was, in the mid-80s, for the first time, the government specified sexual abuse as a category of concern. It added a very cruel codicil. There would be no new money. There was an instant rush of referrals to the local authorities and to the police of children being sexually abused, often being referred by health and welfare services. And that was the context in which the Cleveland crisis happened. There was an exponential rush on services. The government's response to that was total panic. Bear in mind, this was the Thatcher government. And what it came to feel was that this was a kind of crusade by women against men. That was what animated Margaret Thatcher. And there was a determination that there would be no new resources because this was a government that was pledged to restrain social welfare and the welfare state. Now, one of the things that I think then becomes apparent is that the way in which the inquiry's terms of reference were constructed when you're trawling through the documents in the National Archives is a really subtle shift. It moves from the government being informed by the professional experts and public sector officers, the social services inspectorate, for example, all say, actually, these doctors are regarded as reliable. Social services are acting according to the letter of the regulations set out by the government. And that position slowly shifts. And the police mutiny grabs the attention of the Conservative government, and it turns its attention away from what could have been a really useful initiative to call a national inquiry or a national commission into, oh my goodness, this phenomenon, what is it? How big is it? What do we know about it? What do we know about the men who do this, about the children who endure it? What do we know about its consequences? What do we know about the culture that sponsors it? We need to think about this national, indeed international phenomenon. It decided not to do that, and it was a positive decision to not do that, but to hold an inquiry into a local dispute provoked by the police. And so it becomes a quest for, who was doing the wrong thing? What was got wrong? Rather than what actually happened? How were people enabled or disabled from handling something that they'd never really had to deal with, well, in living memory, which was, you may have a child who's 6 or 2, whose body tells a terrible story of rape, and the child won't tell you who did it. Or they may tell you who did it and you decided not to believe it. And that was the crux of the crisis. So instead of thinking about, this is really telling us something very important, how difficult it is for children to tell you, how we have to be curious and use our imagination, consult each other, think about our culture, think about what perpetrators like, think. Instead of doing that, it decides to blame. And so it smacks the paediatricians and says, well, actually, the management of child sexual abuse isn't really your entire responsibility. But it is really. You're to blame for doing something about this. Social workers were to blame for doing something about this. Compare that with the approach of the J inquiry into child sexual abuse in children's homes, which was set up by Theresa May in 2014. Its project was simply to find out what happened, to enable people who had been abused to share their story, to enable people who were responsible for those children to share their story as well, and for the panel of inquiry to think about it and to produce reports on it. And actually what it did was to yield a huge archive of institutional evidence, concern about children and contempt for children in those institutions. It's really useful. It's very interesting, but it scarcely attracted the kind of attention that the Cleveland inquiry attracted, which was like daily in the press at the time. The times when the media was interested in the events in the J inquiry was when a prince was being required to give evidence, or a bishop. It rarely told the story of these really heroic survivors who had lived with a terrible, terrible oppression, who were just determined to come and tell their story.
But the kind of enlightened inquiry that you hoped would have taken place after Cleveland was not going to be possible if they were going to simply quash all evidence of the number of children who had been correctly identified as being sexually abused. I mean, if you're going to deny that the problem even exists? How can you even begin to talk about it?
Exactly. All of us know somebody who has been sexually abused in their childhood. Either ourselves, somebody in our family, somebody on the bus, somebody we're in a relationship with, somebody in our community. There won't be a classroom or a train in Britain at this moment that doesn't have somebody who is either being sexually abused or who has been. It's part of our collective knowledge. But that isn't translated into institutional knowledge that will drive what society does about it. And of course, the other thing that we now know is that society is divided. It's divided between those who think that child sexual abuse is wrong and a disaster for a child, and those who don't, including those who like doing it. So we've never resolved that conflict in our society. We assume that everybody thinks, oh, of course it's bad and it shouldn't happen. But as the great Judith Lewis Herman puts it, this is a crime that is both condemned and condoned.
But, you know, a lot of what you're saying boils down to also, apart from the ideological aspect of it, question of resources, because to accept that the problem exists means that you have to throw resources at it. We've just come out of a period of austerity. We're going through a cost of living crisis. We've got a Labour government who's probably not going to expand any of the Tory, I say Labour government, a Labour opposition that is likely to be the new government. How do we bring about any of these changes when the issue of resources is so much at the nub of everything?
Rahila, I wish I knew the answer. I think what's obvious, the starting point is we have to talk about it. We have to confront the powers that be with this great deception. We want that to be acknowledged. We want the children and the professionals who were so dishonoured to be recognised, and that to be part of a conversation that's about, this is important and it's a priority. And if it's a priority, we have to resource it. And that means we have to find the money. We all know that the cuts in services to children in some areas, it's like 50% over the last 15 years. It's kind of unthinkable. It's devastating to think about what has happened to our society. And it's devastating to think that the political opposition cannot muster the imagination and the guts to say, we're going to change that. And it will only do that if we insist that it be done and make it impossible for it to be not done. I think it's hard, though, because it's not just that cuts have happened, but political confidence has been erased in Britain. A sense that, you know, you can do something, you can make a difference, we must make a difference, has been cruelly eroded. I mean, I think what's interesting at the moment about British political culture is that we have these extraordinary political manifestations in support of the people of Gaza. It's remarkable given the general hollowed outness of our political culture. And that's what we have to think about reinvigorating. We have to think about what needs to be done as if this was 1945 and we were going to invent a welfare state. That's the moment that we're in.
But there are other shifts that take place. I mean, I think the work that you've done on parental alienation syndrome, which has been used in the courts in the US and UK for, I think, about 20 years or so, and is being used to rob women of custody of their children. I mean, that created quite a splash when you published the article last year. And I think, did it not bring about a shift in family court procedures and in, judicial and professional ways of working?
I think there's been, well, I think what you can say is that there is a huge struggle taking place in the family courts. Lawyers, psychologists, registered, committed professionals are in uproar at the way in which the family court is being captured by this ideology of parental alienation. It's an ideology, by the way, that derives from, it was invented in the 1980s by a psychologist who was part of the great backlash against child sexual abuse in the 1980s. So that backlash has contributed to this new backlash. And there is a struggle going on in the family court, but it's one that is, it's often quite technical, and the family courts have been shrouded in a kind of secrecy that derived from the intention to protect children, their privacy, and to protect the reputations of professionals. There's huge pressure to change that. But has it stopped men, usually men, mobilizing the argument that allegations of child sexual abuse have been put into the minds of children who've just been brainwashed by their malign mothers to lie? It's got a headwind at the moment. So there's a conflict, and we have to see that conflict as unresolved, and one that needs not to be confined to the cloisters of the family courts.
Yeah, I mean, we're back to all that great difficulty about dealing with child sexual abuse within the family, aren't we? This is what this suggests as well. I think one of the things that we never talk about in terms of political books is style, the question of style. And I think you're the ultimate stylist. Sorry, that sounds like I was talking about you being a hairdresser. What I mean is,
yeah.
But there is a really beautiful and haunting line at the beginning of your book when you're talking about Minnie, who was, which is a pseudonym for one of the Cleveland children, the only Cleveland child, from what I understand, who actually came out and talked about it as an adult. And you say that she is the ache and howl of this book. And I think, it really, that line really stayed with me. I mean, are you hoping that there will be more Minnies that will come out as a result of this book and maybe lead us to new understandings?
I live in hope, but Minnie, who was a remarkably eloquent and I think heroic survivor who became a kind of detective in her own life. Minnie is the only person who's shared her story in public before and after reading her personal records. Bear in mind, she was, how old was she then? She was 8 or 10 during the Cleveland events. She feels that she was rescued by Dr. Marietta Higgs, who at the time was the most maligned woman in Britain. But she was also surrounded by a national narrative promoted by the mass media, promoted by her community, the local MP, and of course, the perpetrators in her family. The perpetrators, the man who did it, and her mother who didn't protect her. So what was she to make of her own life? Did she have access to her own story. She had to really struggle to make sense of it and to work it out and then to tell it. So I think what that teaches us is that the Cleveland children have lived with a national lie about them. Many of the children in Cleveland were too young. Some were 2, 6, 8. What did they know other than what they were told by the adults and the experiences, the personal experiences that they had that could not be spoken? So there's a huge dilemma for the children in Cleveland who were not able to tell their story. And that tells us something, again, very important about just how hard it is to speak of this.
Mhm.
It's so hard. And so it's incumbent on society to take responsibility for making it tellable and hearable. And what we've learned is that hearing atrocities makes you a participant in the story,
Mhm.
and therefore makes you responsible for changing that story. It's huge. Of course, it can be done. Minnie is there.
Yeah.
We're all there.
And you've done an amazing detective's job, really, in sort of uncovering all of this as well. So thank you. Thank you for a really powerful, very accessibly written book. We have actually got a huge number of questions here. So I'm wondering whether we ought to go straight to questions, unless there is anything I haven't asked and that you would like to add before we go to the questions.
I'd just like to say one more thing,
Yeah, please do.
which is thank you, Rahila.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, we can do all the thank yous later in private. Okay, so let me go straight to the first question. It says, in your book, you say, and I quote, "What is deference if not a protection racket?" Can you say a little bit about how patriarchal power fails children?
Yeah, oh, that's an interesting question. That was in the context of the Jay inquiry, which concluded that one of the problems about confronting abuse by members of the establishment was a culture of deference. And I argue with that in the book because I'm saying, wait a minute, deference is a disposition, a kind of power wielded and enforced, and is then felt by those who are subordinate. So what we do know is that there were lots and lots of children who tried to shout about some of the things that were being done to them by members of the establishment. We also know that there were lots, of course, who were silenced. The recent book by Charles Spencer is indicative of the extraordinary impact of establishment power. So my argument with the word deference is that it doesn't help to describe the regimes of power that control what children might think, say, and do.
Okay. Let me go to the next question. So the timeline in the back of your book ends in 2023, poignantly with the death of Sinead O'Connor.
Yeah.
What would you like to be able to add in the future timeline in terms of what you would like to see happen next?
That's a very big, far too big question.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next one?
Well, I think what we all kind of know what
Yeah.
we think we would like to happen here, which is something.
Okay.
Something.
But that something's too big to go into right now. Okay.
Well,
So,
we have to find political allies and professional allies, and we tell the truth.
Yeah. And hope not to be silenced.
And hope not to be silenced.
So the next comment is, one of the things that I don't understand is, given that this was such a huge story at the time, and in my opinion, B's book turns what most of us thought we knew on its head. And that's absolutely true. That's exactly how I felt too. Why the book isn't getting more attention, i.e. in mainstream media, or have I missed it? It feels like a double insult, lack of willingness to acknowledge the issue then, and now the same all over again.
I wish I knew the answer, but it's true. I have been, I think, and everybody involved in this project, staggered by the wall of indifference to what we have come to know. Not least the institutional cover-up that has determined child protection practice ever since. I am, so to say, breath took and very disappointed.
Mm. Mm.
I don't really understand it.
Does Beatrix think that the relative silence on child abuse is a reluctance by people generally to acknowledge it happens in the scale that it does? Is it just too awful to contemplate? And this makes it a topic to avoid. Sort of connected to the last question, really.
Yeah. Again, the wonderful Judith Lewis Herman, I thought, was very eloquent about this. She describes this, the response to child sexual abuse, as responding to an anathema. We withdraw from it. There's also terrific work that's been done on those who bore witness to what had happened in the concentration camps during the Second World War. It took 20 years for that story to begin to be told, for the survivor's story to begin to be told, because of course many didn't survive. And the telling of it breached this dangerous dialectic between silence as both defeat and sanctuary. And I think for sexual abuse survivors, that dynamic prevails. There is safety in silence, if only safety from shame.
Mm.
There's also safety in silence because it protects the listener from the atrocity that then becomes something that cannot be not known.
Mm. But then also leads to a huge amount of trauma and unresolved mental health issues if it's been suppressed and not
social agony.
Yeah. Okay. Would like to raise some parallels between Cleveland and the Orkney child abuse scandal, which followed not long after in 91-92, including damaging and stultifying effects on child protection, which continue. Do you want to comment on that? That just seems to be a comment.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the Orkney was blighted. Orkney happened. It concerned children who were several children from several different families who were being abused, but the investigation of what was happening to those children was absolutely blighted by the Cleveland effect. There were other cases that were equally significant, sometimes of organised abuse within families that were being uncovered at the same time as Cleveland, that were successfully investigated. Children were protected, but the narrative became a kind of legend that was corrupted by the Cleveland effect. So the Cleveland effect really reframed how all sorts of very different contexts and cultures of sexual abuse came to be understood or not. It was the framing device, and that has been written about very, very interestingly, the way in which Cleveland was enlisted to chide, caution and silence professionals, to scare them.
Okay. Next question says, thanks for speaking truths about child sexual abuse endemic. It's clear government will not do anything, as you say. How do we, across the women's sector and movement, build a more collective, radical voice for structural change? What are we missing?
Well, one of the lessons of that time, the 1980s, was that there were really important coalitions, sometimes quite informal coalitions, that were established between women's movements, rape crisis centres, women's aid, the police, health workers, and social services, of course, and that included, there were feminists who were also involved in all of those contexts. And that produced a kind of synergy that was extremely effective. It was kiboshed by the effect of the Cleveland inquiry, but nonetheless, it had been terribly, terribly important in constructing a context in which child sexual abuse could be understood and addressed. That's the kind of, I think it's a model of the kind of political imagination that's needed to change the culture, to intervene in the culture. Of course, one of the difficulties now is that there is a huge backlog in the courts. Rape crisis centres have been scythed. The women's sector has been decimated. Police, I don't know how many official investigations into police culture I've read that just go on repeating and repeating and repeating that they don't get it. It's extraordinary. They don't get it. And the public sector at the local government level, which has been given, actually, the responsibility for all of this has been dumped on them, has been scythed. So the conditions at the moment are very tough. They're much tougher, I think, than they were in the 1980s. But that...
That's something, isn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
It does.
Sorry, I interrupted. Carry on.
No, you didn't.
Okay. Shall we move on to the next question, which says, I'm old enough to remember the huge press conference of the Cleveland events. I had young children at the time. As you say, it was every day for a long time. Was this attention more than a little to do with the fact that Marietta Higgs was a female doctor?
Yeah, there was a sort of obsession with the presence of very robust, confident, kind, well-informed women at the heart of the events in Cleveland. And I think nationally, it could be said that there was a generation of women who'd gone into health and social services who were very energetic, very well educated, very committed to this issue. And so, of course, and what we also know is that the welfare professions were a good space for women to have a professional life in. It's interesting that Elizabeth Butler Sloss, who was the chair of the inquiry, who then became a very celebrated judge, she describes how the Prime Minister at the time, as I mentioned earlier, thought that this was a women against men thing. The police in Cleveland thought that they were up against this coven of harridans. Elizabeth Butler Sloss, I think, also describes how the women in Cleveland were regarded as, I think she regarded them at the time, as Marxist, and she stumbles over the word Marxist, feminists. Well, they might have been feminists, whether they were Marxists or not, I don't know. But that was how these women were characterized.
Maybe she was talking about you.
What of course was shocking to the police was that they were encountering women who knew something, who had professional confidence, who had been given a political mandate. In 1986, the government had issued a circular saying, "Thou shalt intervene, do something, respond to evidence of child sexual abuse." There it was in the commandments. And so they did. And because they'd got that mandate, they were, of course, empowered. And there was a culture at the time that was very alive in the institutions to the dangers that some children endured. In the 1970s and 1980s, there were great scandals about child deaths. And it was in the wake of all of that that there was huge concern about the dangerous lives that some children lived. And of course, there was Childline that was set up in 1986, which gave children the possibility of picking up a phone anonymously and telling somebody something. Now, those were very, very important. It was a very important conjuncture. But of course, as soon as that rush of referrals began to hit the system, it crashed. And women were blamed. Marxists were blamed. Blame described the response.
I remember that time you talk about the setting up of Childline in 1986. I was a member of the Outright newspaper collective at the time, and we used to publish articles saying that anecdotally, we think it's 1 in 4 children who've been abused, and we used to get regularly criticized for, exaggerating, for, the whole kind of women against men, feminists, against men, and so on. And the moment the Childline was set up and their first annual report confirmed that that was a statistic that they would also agree with, it made a big difference to how we were seen and how we were no longer considered to be extremist in our assertions. Those sorts of shifts do and have taken place, but they feel so minimal in relation to this massive kind of iceberg that we are facing.
I don't know whether they're minimal, Rahila.
Yeah, but they feel minimal.
I hear what you're saying. I think they're precarious.
Yeah.
They're vulnerable to attack because, of course, there are people who have an interest in abuse. And there are people who are terrified of it. And there are institutions that are terrified of it. And so it's tough.
Okay, the next question is a little bit of a biggie, or maybe a bit more controversial. I don't know what you think. How do you think the current obsession with misogynistic gender ideology is influencing the abuse of children? And how do we ensure that the necessary backlash against gender ideology does not prevent the absolutely necessary interventions in families by professionals when abuse is suspected?
This is a very interesting question. When there was a huge conflict in the Green Party in some years back over precisely this territory, when an advocate for trans rights, nobody was against trans rights. I don't know anybody who is against trans rights, actually. But a person who had been a man and was transitioning to be a woman had lived in a family where her father and and advocate and actually election agent, was arrested, tried and convicted for horrific crimes against a child that involved torture and very, very gross sexual abuse. And the party's response initially was not really to think about what had happened to this child, to think about only this young person who was transitioning and who was a very robust advocate of trans rights in the Green Party. And it became impossible to address the central issue here, which was that there was stuff about fetishism, very sadistic child sexual abuse hovering around this family and that culture, and it couldn't be addressed. I left the Green Party when it became clear that it wasn't going to address it. I have to say, there are many, many women and men who've stuck it out and who are really trying to sort this out. But I think the reason that there's something kind of something rustling very important in the question that's been asked is that there are elements of trans ideology that are very worrying when it comes to children, and wings of it that are trying to reinstate sexual interest in children as legitimate. I don't think that it's universal amongst trans activists, but it's a presence and it isn't addressed. The other thing I think that's interesting about the parallel is that there is a kind of ideological capture that's been evident in the way that certainly the Stonewall promotion of trans rights has been projected, that's not really enabled people to think about what it is that's going on here. And that kind of ideological capture has been replicated in child protection politics as well. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, we've got few more questions, but some of them I think cover similar ground to what we've already talked about in terms of how to address patriarchy and so on and so forth in relation to child sexual abuse. Okay, I'm going to read out this question. How do we sustain, we've only got a minute or two, so the question's pretty long. How do we sustain the current feminist attention and energy around this in the face of the inevitable patriarchal resistance to what women and children know? We only seem to be able to collectively look at this in retrospect, not in the present. The ICSA was about the 80s, for example. So part of the resistance is the refusal to consider the experiences of children in the present. We appear to be only to be prepared to look when we can say that was then and now it's different.
Well, the answer to that is, as your questioner will know, it's not different. It's not different. The figures have been horribly consistent for as long as statistics have been collected about the prevalence of child sexual abuse. The thing that we have to have in our heads is that attention ebbs and flows, consciousness ebbs and flows. And the vital thing for us as feminists is to have patriarchal sexual violence always on our political agenda, always. And I mean, it is. And Women's Place UK has been great about keeping that flame alive, so to say. And I think what's going to have to be very, very important is bringing our collective knowledge of this to the attention of the political party that is likely to be the next government. I think we have to.
I think the question also suggesting that it's the sort of shroud of history, isn't it? That something that is past can be looked at in the face and confronted. But if it's happening right now, it's something we would prefer not to acknowledge.
Do you know, the thought that comes to mind as you say that is the extraordinary moment when people will remember the case of Baby P, the little boy who was murdered. Well, a less well-known feature of that case is that one of the men responsible for killing Baby P, Peter Connolly, also raped his little sister. She was 2 at the time. When his death, when he died, she was taken into care and for the first time was in the warm embrace of a family that wasn't dangerous. And instantly she talked about this man's sexual abuse, rape of her. She was 2. By the time she was 4, that evidence came to a court and he was convicted. So she had been heard because there was huge attention being paid to the children in this family and to the adults who'd abused them. She arrived into a safe context in which she was seen and heard and taken very seriously. And people who had campaigned for a long time to enable the evidence of very young children to find its way to a court really succeeded. And it got there. Now that happened, actually it's less than 10 years ago, I think. So all is not lost. And it is still happening. And it could be happening if you're 2.
That's a fairly positive note on which to end this discussion. So thank you very much, Bea, for participating in this discussion. And thank you to all of those who've joined us this evening and all the questions that were put to us, which were wide-ranging and enabled a really interesting discussion. And thank you to Women's Place UK for hosting this.
Thank you.
Thank you.